So, as I said, this is obviously, if you know anything about Christianity, this is one of the most controversial texts in the New Testament. It's a very controversial chapter, but hopefully that won't sort of hinder us tonight from trying to get to what it means. Now, Christians of all sorts of different stripes and sorts will have their different views on it. For some people, all that we read this evening in Mark chapter 13 and the parallel passage in Matthew 24 is all about the future. For Christians who we would call dispensationalists, they basically would say all the events that Jesus talked about there are all about the future. That will take place in the future, and it'll happen to the nation of Israel. Obviously, as a church, we're non-dispensational in our theology. We don't divide between God's people. We don't see God's church now and then when in the time to come there'll be a great rapture and the church will disappear and then God will once again deal with the nation of Israel. We would see that as not being taught in the scriptures. And we can't go into that this evening. And then there are Christians who would say, well, yes, some of this chapter is about the future, about the Lord's coming, but the beginning of the chapter is to do with what happened to the nation of Israel in AD 70. Now, I must profess that used to be the view that I had. And there are many Christians within Reformed circles who would still hold to that view, and that might be your view this evening. But I now have been drawn back to the text time and time again, having to look at the meaning of this text. I do believe what the Lord is saying in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 all the way to verse 31 has to do with the events that took place in the first century in the destruction of the Jewish temple. And that might be surprising to many of you, especially considering verses 24 to 27, but we'll come to that in a minute. But what I'm presenting to you this evening is not new for Christians. Christians throughout the history of the church have believed this. People like Eusebius, the great church father, John Calvin, John Owen, Matthew Henry, John Gill, B.B. Warfield, and the late R.C. Sproul all believed that the events that Jesus described there took place in the first century, in the destruction of the Jewish temple. And that's the view I'll be presenting to you this evening. Hopefully, as we look into the text, you will see, I think, why that makes sense. And just keep in mind the context. Remember all those weeks ago that I spoke to you about the parable of the fig tree. That took place, or the day after rather, as Jesus explains the meaning of the parable of the fig tree. That took place on the Wednesday in the last week of Jesus' life before the crucifixion. That was the Wednesday, and all these events are still on the Wednesday leading to Matthew 13. This all takes place in this one day. Remember, when Jesus was talking about the cursing of the fig tree, it was an analogy he was applying about the temple. The temple was no longer to be the place where God was to be worshipped, because the Jews had not worshipped God in the right way. And if you remember, as Pete Harrison was talking last week about the widow's offering and everything there to do with the temple, well, again, the issue of the temple's there in place, isn't it? Remember, in the Old Covenant, the widow really shouldn't have been having to put into the offering, because she should have been taken care of by the Jewish law. Orphans and widows were to be provided for. So what I believe, when you read of that widow having to put in money into the coffers, it's not a good thing. It's not a lesson. Be like the widow. Because the lesson from that would be what? Well, she gave everything. Therefore, when you give folks, you got to give everything. I don't think that's the lesson. It's a judgment on the Jewish nation. In fact, in a parallel passage, if you read Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 23, what does Jesus say in verse 38 as that chapter comes to an end? He says to the Jewish people, "See, your house, which is the temple, is left to you desolate," is left to you desolate. This chapter 13 is a judgment on the nation of Israel. In fact, the key really to locating the meaning of this text is in verse 30. If you look at verse 30, what does Jesus say? He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And I know all the arguments because I used to give them myself. It's a future generation. That's yet to come. But really, you have to do all sorts of gymnastics to make that word. In fact, if you just look at the word generation in Mark's gospel or in Matthew's gospel, every time Matthew or Mark use that word generation, it's always used of the generation Jesus is speaking to. So when Jesus says all these things will take place in this generation, well, that's the key to understanding the chapter. Well, let's dig in and let's see what the Lord is saying. If you look at verses 1 to 4, it has to do with the destruction of the temple. Notice as Jesus comes out of the temple, one of his disciples points out the wonder of the temple. This was a marvelous, huge structure that Herod had begun to build all those many years ago before the disciples had even come into existence. But notice in verse 2, Jesus said to them, "Do you see this great building? There will be not left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And so Jesus responds to that disciple's questions. He talks about the coming of the end of the temple. He brings that excitement about looking at this marvelous building to an end because he talks about the fact that this temple is going to be thrown down. It's going to be destroyed. And we know historically from Roman and Jewish records that this took place in AD 70. The destruction of the Jewish temple took place in AD 70. But notice as Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, the other disciples, come to him and they ask him privately about this prophecy. They want to know what Jesus is getting at. And they say, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And if you notice in their questionnaire, the disciples seem to think that the destruction of the temple, Jesus' second coming, and the end of the age would all happen at the same time. They believed that all those events would happen together. But then notice how Jesus responds. Jesus' answer not only is a response to the disciples' question, but also a correction to the misconception that the three events would occur all at the same time. In fact, if a prophet forecasts a prophecy or a catastrophe that's going to come, then people will want to know when it's going to take place, right? If a prophet says Countess Thorpe Church is going to be destroyed next week or in a coming time, not that we believe there were prophets, you're going to want to know, how are we know when this is going to come about? And this is what the disciples want to know. When will these things happen? How will we know when will this take place? And so the disciples' question in verse 4 conveys these concerns. And so Jesus, in his response, answers those questions of the disciples. See, the disciples, if you look at verses 5 to 23, and we'll try and dig in now, the disciples were concerned about the temple, but instead Jesus told them to be concerned about themselves. I was trying to emphasize in the narrative, look how many times Jesus tells the disciples, watch out, be on your guard. Jesus was warning them, those disciples, to watch out, to be on their guard. Why? Because false prophets would arise and tried to lead astray, if possible, even the elect of God. And that's what Jesus says. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. Well, we see this in the book of Acts. If you look at the book of Acts, we won't look at all these verses. What do you see after Jesus ascends into heavens and the disciples are commissioned to go and spread the gospel? What do you see arise? You see many false prophets come onto the scene. Just a few of these you notice in Acts, the book of Acts. Acts chapter 5 and verse 36. 400 people were led astray by Theudas, a false prophet. In Acts chapter 8 verses 9 and 10, Simon the magician, of who people said, this man is the power of God that is called great. And then in Acts chapter 13, verse 6, as Paul is on his missionary journey, he bumps into the Jewish false prophet named Bar-Jesus. See, even in the time of the disciples, just after Jesus ascended into heaven, what did the disciples and the apostles face? They faced false prophets. In fact, the apostle John notes this in 1 John 2:18. He says this, "Children, it is the last hour, as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. So now many Antichrists have come." Notice when John is speaking in the first century, and he talks about the Antichrist is coming, but yet many Antichrists, what? Have come. Have come. That was going on in the first century. But what about wars and rumors of wars? Because from growing up I grew up in a dispensational church when I was young, and even in my teenage years. And every time there was a war in the Middle East, someone in the church would be pulling out Matthew 24 or citing from Mark 13. Because the war in the Middle East, therefore, the end must be coming. But again, consider the context. Jesus and the disciples are living at a time called, under the time of the Roman rule, and at that time there was something called the Pax Romana, the time of Roman peace. They were living in what was considered a peaceful time. In fact, Christian historian Philip Schaff, the noted historian Philip Schaff, notes that this time of peace remained comparatively undisturbed until the time of Nero. Aubrey mentioned Nero this morning. Nero was the emperor that instituted the Jewish war and sent his legions in to destroy the Jewish temple. And as Aubrey mentioned this morning, Nero died in AD 68 because of civil war within the Roman Empire. So you see, towards the end of Nero's life, this time of peace was coming to an end. In fact, the Jewish war against the Romans began in the spring of AD 70, when Vespasian, another Roman emperor, was commissioned to move towards Israel. And these rumors of wars were signs then for that generation. The time of peace that the Roman Empire had once lived under had gone. And now it was a time of war. In fact, the Jews were now fighting against the Roman armies. But then in verse 8, what does it say? Famines will take place. Well, again, if you read the book of Acts, just go to Acts chapter 11, and what do you read? And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over the world. All this took place, it says, in the days of Claudius. Claudius was another emperor who ruled between AD 41 to AD 54. In fact, Josephus tells us, a Jewish historian, that Judea did suffer a severe famine between AD 45 to 48. So even in the book of Acts, you see these things being fulfilled. In fact, when it talks about there will be a great famine all over the world, that's not talking about the whole globe, because the Greek word there is oikonomia, and we're going to see the meaning of that in a minute. In other words, it's just talking about an inhabited area, the Roman world. There was a famine at that time in the Roman world, because we get to the next verse as we try and move through Matthew 13 to verse 10. And this is a verse that often gets many people of why this could not be the first century, because notice what Jesus says, and the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And people will say, well, the gospel hasn't been preached to all nations, therefore Jesus cannot be coming back. So how could this all be proclaimed, all this be fulfilled then, before AD 70? Well, I just want you to consider a few statements in the New Testament. Paul, when he's writing to the Colossians, and he's writing to the Colossians about 60 to 61 AD, says this. He's talking about the gospel, which has come to you as indeed in the whole world. It is bearing fruit and increasing as it does among you, since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth. And so there Paul is speaking maybe 30 years after Jesus, right into the church at Colossae, and he's talking about the fact that the gospel has gone out into the whole world. And that's well before AD 70. In fact, when he writes to the church in Rome at about AD 57, he says this: "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world." Your faith is proclaimed in all the world. The gospel had gone out. The disciples and the apostles had taken the gospel message unto the whole world at that time, the known Roman and Greek world. The gospel was in fact bearing much fruit. In fact, if you look at the parallel passage in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 24:14, it doesn't use the word nations, but it uses the word world. Jesus there speaks of the world. Again, that's the Greek word koinonia. And so that means the inhabited world. In fact, there's a passage in the New Testament in Luke 2:1. Remember, at Christmas time we always read Luke 2:1 because what happens, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that the whole world would have to be under a census. Now, that wasn't people living in Africa, it wasn't people living in China, it wasn't people living in North America, South America. It was the Roman world, and that's the world of koinonia. That was the world that had to undergo that census. So we can see how the message of the gospel had gone to the nations before AD 70, because Paul is clearly proclaiming that. But what about verse 13? The one who endures to the end will be saved. Well, again, you have to ask, what does end refer to? AD 70 or the end of the age? Well, just think about it. If it does not refer to AD 70, then Jesus does not answer the disciples' questions about the destruction of the temple. If it is the end of the age, that question is not answered by Jesus. He's ignored it, but he's not doing that. The end must refer to the end of Israel as a nation, and that was followed up by the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And then in verse 14, we come to one of the most controversial verses when Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation. He says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So what is Jesus referring to here? Well, if you know the Old Testament, this is language from the book of Daniel. Daniel in chapter 9 and verse 27 and in chapter 11 verses 31, he talks about the abomination of desolation that would come in history. But if you look in the book of Daniel, when Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation, he's talking about an act of sacrilege that results in widespread destruction. And that's what Jesus is picking up upon here. But Jesus talks about a person because he says that you will see this person standing where he ought not to. Well, I want you to think about this. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by pagan armies is that act that Jesus is talking about. That is what Jesus is talking about. Because notice, in the context, when the disciples see this, they are to flee where? They are to flee from Judea to the mountains. Where is Judea? Judea is in Israel. See, when people today talk about the abomination, that desolation, they're talking about, in their minds, in the end of age, and this will be over the whole world. But Jesus tells these people to flee Judea and go to the mountains. That's a local context. It's not a global context. Jesus isn't thinking about a mass, sphere of the world here. He's talking about the context of Israel, Judea. They are to flee to the mountains. In fact, if you look at a parallel passage again, I'll read this for you, but maybe when you get home, open up the Gospel of Luke, look at chapter 21, and just compare Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21 side by side. Because what does Jesus say there as Luke brings that out? Remember, in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew is speaking to a predominantly Jewish audience. Mark's probably speaking to a very Roman audience, and Luke has, in his mind, as a Gentile audience. But in Luke 21:20, we read these words, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." Let me just read that again. "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." So Luke tells us that the abomination is the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies who are ready to desolate the temple. That's what the abomination of desolation is. In fact, we know from history that the Romans encircled Jerusalem under at least two occasions. One was under Vespasian, another time was under the Roman general Titus. And again, the Jewish historian Josephus recounts how the Romans under Titus offered sacrifices in the temple to Caesar. That is what, in context, I believe, the abomination of desolation is. It is those Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, then going into the temple under the authority of the emperor and offering sacrifices in a place that they should not be. But then notice in verses 19 to 21, and we're having to do this in a very short time, all these controversial verses. But Jesus talks about tribulation coming on the earth. Again, verses 19, "For in those days there will be such tribulation as not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be." And again, people will say, well, how can that be referring to AD 70? Sure, the tribulation is a period at the end of time. But notice, again, the contextual clue is in verse 30. Jesus said all these things would take place in that generation. That generation. Not a future generation, but that generation. But then people will say, well, how can it be claimed that the AD 70 judgment on Jerusalem is the greatest catastrophe in world history? You have World War I, you have World War II. Surely they were greater catastrophes than the event of AD 70. Well, again, they were. In some respect, they were. But we need to consider that when Jesus is speaking here, he has the Old Testament in mind. He's speaking to people who would know the Old Testament, and they would know that when Jesus is speaking here, he's using what we call apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic language. And you don't take apocalyptic language literally. In fact, you can see Jesus is using hyperbole in his speech, because if you look even in the Old Testament, you consider the 10th plague in the book of Exodus, when God brought down those plagues on the nation of Egypt. What do we read? What does Moses say? "There shall be a great cry through all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor ever will be again." Notice the language there. "There'll be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor will ever be again." But if you think that tribulation is something that happens towards the end of time, that covers the whole of the earth, then Egypt will undergo a greater cry, right? Because that will be a great event. See, there's exaggeration used here in the language that Jesus is using. Again, we know from Jewish records, Josephus tells us that 1,100,000 Jews were killed, suffered in that siege on Jerusalem in AD 70. So it was a great tribulation. Many people suffered in that destruction. The worship of the nation of Israel was not acceptable to God, which is why God brought that judgment upon the nation of Israel. That's what Mark chapter 11 to 12 is all about. That worship is no longer acceptable to God. The nation of Israel had rejected God's messengers. John the Baptist was executed, and Jesus was about to be crucified. So when you understand these verses, the tribulation is not global, but it's focused upon the nation of Israel for its rejection of God. God had sent to it prophets. They had rejected those prophets, and they had worshipped God in the wrong way. But what about verses 24 to 31? In those verses, many Christians believe these refer to Jesus' coming at the end of history. And I once thought that. I thought that was a credible view, and many Christians still do. But again, remember the key to interpreting the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 or Luke 21 and Mark 13 is that phrase, these things will take place in that generation. But there are several reasons why this is probably not referring to Jesus' second coming in the context. Again, first, the language there is what we call, again, apocalyptic language. And you generally don't take apocalyptic language. If you don't know where that is in the Bible, think of the book of Ezekiel, the book of Zechariah, the book of Revelation. Lots of signs and symbols being given in those books. You're not meant to take each one literally. They're meant to convey something. So when Jesus talks about the darkening of the sun and the stars falling, he's not talking about the end of history or the end of the world, because that language in the Old Testament is used against the judgment of nations. For example, listen to how the destruction of Babylon is described in Isaiah 13, 10 to 13. Just mark that passage down, Isaiah 13, 10 to 13. This is what the prophet said. For the stars of heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, and lay the low pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make the people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of the hosts. At the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the day of his fierce anger. And just think about the language there that Isaiah is using against that prophecy against the destruction of Babylon. He talks about the sun going dark and the moon will not shed its light. But if you went out into Babylon when that event took place, you would still see the sun shining and the moon giving its light, but Babylon would have been laid waste. The stars would have been shining, the moon would have been shining, the sun would have been shining if you were in Babylon when that event took place. But the nation would have been destroyed. See, that language is used in a symbolic way. It's not meant to be taken literally. We're not to expect the sun to drop out of the sky and to see stars falling down towards earth. You're not meant to take that language literally in the Bible. It's very symbolic. See, in the Old Testament, the destruction of a nation is an event of such proportions that the authors talk about the heavens are disturbed. And so when you read in Mark 13:4, 24 to 25, it doesn't describe the end of history, but it's talking about a change of power. The nation of Israel no longer have that power. They no longer were in the place that they once had, but it's coming to an end. Another reason, a second reason, is that when Jesus talks about the Son of Man, and the Son of Man is a reference to Jesus, it's not a coming to earth that's required in a physical return of Christ. In this context, if you read Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man comes, which is where Jesus is quoting from here in Mark 13. Notice in Daniel 7:13, if you read that passage, the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days to receive power and dominion. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man doesn't come to earth. He goes before the Ancient of Days and receives power and dominion. It's not talking about Jesus coming back to earth. Mark 13:26 rather describes the ascension of the Son of Man to a position of great power and glory in the presence of the Ancient of Days, rather than a return to earth. So the coming that Jesus has in mind here is not a physical coming from heaven to earth. That will happen one day. That will happen one day. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. But it's a coming of divine judgment. Again, remember the context. It's a coming of divine judgment. Again, if you go to the Old Testament and you consider the word of the prophet Isaiah again, in another oracle against Egypt, he says this in Isaiah 19:1. Again, if you want, mark that verse down. He says this, the prophet says, "Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." Again, notice the language, that God comes riding on a cloud and he comes to Egypt. If you look at any commentator, no commentator will tell you that God literally got on a cloud and rode into Egypt. That's not what the prophet is talking about. That's not what he's talking about. It's dramatic judgment language. And when that was fulfilled in the days of Isaiah, that took place under the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in 671 BC. God used that Assyrian king to judge the nation of Egypt. And yet he uses the language of God riding on a cloud. Again, it's not meant to take literally. It's a judgment passage against the nation of Egypt. So when you read those verses in verses 24 to 27, it's not talking about Jesus literally coming back to earth. Rather, it's a judgment passage on the nation of Israel. But then, again, just quickly look at verse 27, where Jesus says, "And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." Because obviously people will say, well, that must be an event at the end of history when God gathers his people together to come to worship him. But we need to think about this. How should we understand the gathering of the elect? Now, in the ESV, it says angels. In fact, in a lot of Bible translations, it'll say angels, and that's the translation of the Greek word angelos. But if you know what angelos means, angelos, the Greek word angelos, can mean angel or messenger. In the Bible, it can mean either of those two things. John the Baptist is described as an angelos. He's a messenger of God. And so when we read here about God sending out his messengers, is probably a better translation, to gather his elect, what is he talking about? Well, Jesus is sending out his messengers to gather his elect throughout the world. In fact, they've already been mentioned. They've already been mentioned in verse 10, because the gospel has gone where? To the nations. The gospel has gone to the nations. That's where the elect of those at that time had been gathered from. And why had they been gathered? They're being gathered to form a new community by the proclamation of the gospel. It's God's new covenant people. And again, remember Paul's language that the gospel had gone out into all nations. And how had it gone out into all nations? Well, the apostles and the disciples, the messengers of God, had taken the gospel out into the whole world. See, with the end of the nation of Israel, a new community is needed to worship and serve God. And that's what you see Jesus talking about there. And again, just to re-emphasize, the answer to the disciples' question about when the judgment will fall is answered in verse 30. This is the key to understanding this chapter. "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And as hard as it might be, if you've got that view of the future in mind, when I went through this time and time again, it's so hard to get around the fact that this generation is talking about that generation in the first century. I've read a number of commentaries, and they'll all try and do all sorts of gymnastics to try and get around that. In fact, some will even state it plainly, yeah, it has to be, even though they might think it's going to happen in the future. Because that's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about that generation in the first century. It would happen in the lifetime of the disciples. And we know historically, the nation of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem took place in AD 70. So it was literally 37 years after Jesus had spoken those words. It happened in the disciples' generation. It happened in the disciples' generation. But I want you to think about it. If Mark 13, 28, 31 refers to Jesus' return, it seems that Jesus was mistaken. If you believe that refers to a future coming, as I once did, then it would seem that was mistaken, because it says it would happen in that generation. And that's why you've had many liberal scholars try and say, well, Jesus was a false prophet because he got it wrong. They misunderstood the context, but they were recognizing that Jesus said these things would take place in that generation, and Jesus got it wrong because he didn't come back. But he wasn't referring to his second coming. He was referring to the destruction of Israel. Jesus predicted an event that did transpire within the time frame he set forth. And it came about in AD 70. Then as we bring this to an end, verses 32 and 37, Jesus says in verse 32, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Now Jesus is talking about his second coming. Now he's referring to his second coming. You notice in the text, Jesus switches from the plural, those days, verses 19 and 24. If you look at them, in those days, but now here Jesus says, but concerning that day, singular. And it's a day that only the Father knows about. It's a day that only the Father knows about. But what's the importance of all this? Notice Jesus highlights 3 times, what does he say? Stay awake. Stay, and some of you may be struggling tonight. Stay awake. Stay awake. Sam, are you awake? You ready for Christ's return? You should be awake as the Lord's people. We should be active as Christians. That's what Jesus' point here. You do not know the time of the hour. Notice Jesus offered no signs for his second coming, but he did offer the warning, stay awake. Because he says it's like a man going out into a distant country. Those people would have known that's him going out into the nations. And he'll come back at a time that only the Father knows. But he offers the warning to his people to stay awake, to be active. We are not to be passive as Christians. We are to serve the Lord faithfully. We are to stay awake, to be active in our Christian lives and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're not to be consumed with what's going on in the Middle East and rumors of wars. Those things have already taken place. And see, this is the thing. The modern prophetic movement that sees the tribulation and all those events yet to come is distracting people from a proper interpretation of Scripture. It causes unnecessary fear and inactiveness in the Christian life. Because if all of a sudden one day you could be swept up to heaven at a time when you don't know, then why would you go and evangelize? Why would you bother doing anything in your Christian life? If Jesus could come back at any moment, See, that's not what Jesus says. It's not what Jesus says, but he does tell us to stay awake. He does tell us to stay awake. And hopefully that's helped. Maybe it's brought some confusion.